Thank you, and welcome everybody, and a special welcome to those of us joining us online via Zoom. And I should apologise to those members for not being able to join us at the last meeting a month ago, when we had a catastrophic problem with the internet in the Society of Antiquaries, which has all been solved very well for this meeting. Those of you who wanted to join us a month ago, we will be making arrangements later in the year for Alan Nelson's lecture to be delivered again online, and we'll send details of that around later in the year. But before introducing our speaker tonight, I'd like to invite the Secretary to read the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you. So the third meeting of the 133rd season took place at the Society of Antiquaries, Burlington House, Piccadilly, London, and online via Zoom on Tuesday, the 20th of January, 2026. Dr. Nicholas Bell, President, was in the chair. After the minutes of the previous meeting had been read and signed, Dr. Bell introduced Professor Alan Nelson, who delivered a lecture entitled The Printed Book Catalogues of Sir Thomas Phillips, 1792 to 1872, Eccentric Publications of an Eccentric Man. When the meeting was open to discussion, the following took part: Professor Tony Edwards, Professor Miriam Foote, and Mr. Giles Mandelbrot. Dr. Bell thanked Professor Nelson warmly for his paper.
Thank you, Liam. Is it your wish that I sign these as an accurate record? Thank you. Thank you. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, who is Barbara Heritage, the Myrenka Family Director of Collections, Exhibition and Scholarly Initiatives at Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. In her role at Rare Book School, Barbara Heritage has worked to promote bibliography more widely among the humanistic disciplines. And in 2017, she and Donna Sy co-chaired an international conference under the title Bibliography Among the Disciplines, which resulted in a book they co-edited that was published by Routledge last year. And she's done much more in the University of Virginia as a professional rare book curator, but her particular interests have always focused on the Brontës. And her PhD, which also is from the University of Virginia, was on the subject Brontë and the Bookmakers, Jane Eyre in the 19th Century Marketplace. And she's published several articles on several of the Brontës in several different publications and in journals in the US and in this country. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome her tonight to give a lecture on the subject under the title Staying in Print, the Brontës 1846 to 1876. So please really welcome Barbara Heritage.
Thank you for having me. It's a surprise and pleasure to see so many colleagues, people I haven't seen for decades even. I want to thank Karin Limper-Hertz, Leon Sims, the Bibliographical Society as a whole for this invitation to speak with you tonight. I also want to acknowledge Rare Book School at the University of Virginia for supporting my time here in London, as well as John A. Linseth, a lifetime member of this society, who is also a leading collector of Brontéana. I'm currently completing a descriptive bibliography of Mr. Linseth's collection, which has informed and illuminated much of what I will present here tonight. Finally, as a past recipient of a research grant from this society, I would be remiss in not acknowledging your own role in advancing my research here in the UK. Thank you. I want to begin my talk tonight with a cautionary tale. Some years ago, Book History published a popular article titled Jane Eyre Fever, deciphering the astonishing popular success of Charlotte Brontë in antebellum America. The article opens with a lively description of a fierce competition between two rival American publishers, Harper and Brothers in New York and T.B. Peterson, a Philadelphia firm known for publishing cheap editions of works by Dickens. The article claims not only that T.B. Peterson published a rival edition of Jane Eyre, but also that Peterson attempted to publish The Tenant of Wildfell Hall afterwards. The problem with his history is that there is no evidence that Peterson ever published either book, or that he even attempted to publish either book. I came to this conclusion after long, extended searches in Brontë bibliographies, in WorldCat, in newspaper databases, and after scouring the records of the antiquarian book trade, which are numerous. In fact, I learned that it was a different publisher altogether who planned to publish The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and he was forced out by Harper & Brothers, a story I will tell later as part of this talk. You may be wondering, as I did, how could such a mistake be made? Today, we are inundated with electronic resources, including databases full of digitized materials. But these can be misleading for some researchers who do not use them hand in hand with descriptive bibliographies and original copies. For example, this critic described another edition of Jane Eyre that never existed, a book published in Cleveland by H.B. Pearson, who was a retail grocer and produce dealer, as we see in this advertisement listing his new stock of groceries and provisions amid other ads for hemp seeds, prime pork, candles, maple molasses, oats, and candles. Pearson operated a literary depot where he sold used copies of novels as a secondhand dealer, as the headline to another advertisement makes clear, not new, but good. In the 1850s, he briefly published a handful of titles out of Cincinnati, but no copies of Jane Eyre. This cautionary tale is meant to illustrate that digitizing historical records alone is not enough. We must also learn how to interpret the historical record. This is part of a larger and more systemic problem in the humanities. Very few graduate programs in the United States offer advanced training in descriptive bibliography. The Department of English at the University of Virginia is one of the very few places that does. For this reason, many people who want to learn about bibliography come to Rare Book School. It was at Rare Book School that I learned through hands-on work with original examples how to identify and date the graining patterns of publishers' cloth, how to collate books, and how to research laid and wove paper, and crucially, for 19th century publications, how to look for the sewing. More recently, Stephen Tabor's course on analytical bibliography illuminated differences between stop press corrections and separate printings. This is why organizations like Rare Book School and the Bibliographical Society are so crucial in this moment. Bibliography is an endangered practice, yet it is vital for interpreting the past. Now I want to take you back to a different moment in time, October 1855, 8 years after Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey were first published in 1847. If you were to walk into a bookshop on the Strand or on Baker Street, you would likely find Smith Elder and Company's uniform edition of the works of Currer Bell for sale, 4 crown octavos, priced at 6 shillings each, and handsomely bound by Westley's and Company in matching bindings covered in purplish-brown Morocco cloth. The set included Jane Eyre in its 5th edition, the 2nd edition of Shirley, and the newly published 2nd edition of Villette, along with Currer Bell's edition of Ellis and Acton Bell's Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey, which were bound together in one volume. One novel by the Bells is conspicuously absent from this set, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. Tenant was in print, but it had survived only in the form of a Bowdlerized edition, published by Thomas Hodgson as number 106 of his Parlor Library. It sold for just 2 shillings, and it could be found in some of the bargain bookstalls in town. Why was Tenant not included in the uniform edition? At that time, it was deemed by reviewers as unfit for reading. One critic claimed that it could not be read by the very class of persons to whom it would be most useful, namely imaginative girls, owing to the profane expressions, inconceivably coarse language, and revolting scenes and descriptions which its pages are disfigured. Charlotte Brontë deliberately excluded The Tenant of Wildfell Hall from the uniform edition of the works of Currer Bell, writing to her publisher in 1850, "Wildfell Hall, it hardly appears to me desirable to preserve." Her wording here is significant. Publishers had an interest in not only what would sell well, but also what was deemed worth preserving on a shelf in a home library. When Jane Eyre was published in hardcover in the US by Wilkins, Carter and Company as the first title in their home library of entertaining books, the publishers deemed it worth preservation, as they declared in their advertisement. Publication within a select series served as an act of endorsement, indicating that included titles were worthy and appropriate for reading at home. Similarly, the choice to issue a novel in hardcover had consequences with respect to whether a book survived in print and how it survived in print. These tensions run throughout the early publishing history of the Brontë sisters' works. Whether excluded from Harper's library of select novels or ignored by Tauchnitz, novels by Emily and Anne were repeatedly set apart from those of their elder sister, Charlotte. Even so, US publishers tried to have it both ways, capitalizing on the confusion surrounding the identity of Currer Bell to sell copies of the Bell's other novels. Wuthering Heights was marketed in connection with Jane Eyre from its first appearance in print in England and America, and for a good reason. One American reviewer likened Jane Eyre to a meteor. It swept across the literary heavens, drawing towards it the gaze of thousands. This talk, which is based on a forthcoming book chapter, as well as my catalog for John Linseth, traces key elements from this transatlantic publishing history of the novels from 1848 to 1855, a period when American publishers and booksellers tried to pass off Wuthering Heights, as well as The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and Agnes Grey, as works by Currer Bell. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the initial release, promotion, and publication of all of Emily and Anne's works in America were inflected by this sort of misinformation. The American rage for Currer Bell's work, described as Jane Eyre fever in the press, was, in many respects, a fever dream by design, fed by publishers who knowingly misled their customers to profit from the growing craze. I'll then briefly discuss the early European publishing history of the sisters' novels, particularly through the lens of translation. I'll wrap up by returning to the year 1855, the year of Charlotte Brontë's death, which marked another pivotal moment in the publication of the sisters' novels, as my study of Smith Elder's publishers' ledgers reveals. Elizabeth Gaskell's 1857 biography, The Life of Charlotte Brontë, would raise the sisters' works to even loftier heights and lead to a new phase in the publication of their remarkable works. Before Jane Eyre was published, in October 1847, the name Currer Bell was unknown. In May 1847, the sisters had paid the London publisher Allott and Jones £36, 10 shillings, to have 1,000 copies of their collection of poetry printed and advertised under the pseudonyms of Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. But the work had sold just 2 copies by June of the following year. The story of how the sisters next struggled to find a publisher for their novels is well known. Charlotte later recounted how she began writing Jane Eyre in August of 1846, while her ill-fated 1-volume tale, The Professor, was plodding its weary round in London. In fact, when The Professor was finally published posthumously in 1857, it appeared in 2 volumes. Early on, the sisters had little practical conception of how their manuscripts would appear in print, or how to market their work to best advantage. Emily and Anne ultimately decided to publish Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey in a 3-volume set with Thomas Cultley Newby, who requested a subsidy of £50 toward the publication of 350 copies, a sum to be returned once a sufficient number of copies should be sold to pay expenses. Although the arrangement was made months before Jane Eyre was published, production was delayed, and Jane Eyre appeared in print first on October 19th. It was the success, the great success of Jane Eyre, that finally spurred Newby into action, publishing Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey on December 4th, 1847. But only 250 copies were printed, and in the end, Emily and Anne never received back their initial payment. In contrast, Jane Eyre was specifically formulated for a marketplace dominated by circulating libraries. Jane Eyre subsumed and transformed well-known genres within each of its 3 volumes: the orphan story, the Gothic romance, the religious tract, changing them into something familiar but powerfully new. George Smith initially paid Charlotte £100 for the copyright, but he eventually sent her an additional £400, given it several editions in 3 volumes. At £1, 11 shillings, 6 pence, Jane Eyre sold for the standard price of a 3-decker at the time, an amount that was approximately equivalent to the week's wages of a skilled laborer. The artificially high price of multi-volume fiction forced most readers to join subscription circulating libraries, which purchased copies from publishers at a discount, an arrangement that also helped ensure that publishers recovered production costs. Jane Eyre appeared in no less than 3 3-volume editions. Its sudden success was unexpected. Published as an autobiography that had been edited by Bell, it provoked all kinds of speculation as to its origin. When Newby's advertisements began to circulate comparing Wuthering Heights to Jane Eyre, so did the mistaken belief that both novels had been written by the same person, confusion that Newby promulgated to his profit, and that Brontë and her publishers tried to dispel. When Smith Elder published a second edition on January 22nd, it was with the title page presenting Bell as the book's author, not its editor. By January 1848, the New York publisher D. Appleton was importing editions of Jane Eyre from London, but the novel's high price made it inaccessible to most Americans. Harper & Brothers was quick to capitalize on the sales potential for a U.S. publication in 1 volume. Unhindered by international copyright, the Harpers had their typesetters compose Jane Eyre into the 2-column format of its standard cheap edition. Bound in wrappers and priced at 25 cents, Jane Eyre was issued on January 4th, 1848 as number 109 of Harper's Library of Select Novels. Demand for Jane Eyre continued to grow in America, where the novel could circulate more cheaply than in England. Some American publishers attempted to divide up the market for the Brontes' works regionally, though, as you will hear, not many, if any, publishers could successfully compete against the Harpers, whose enterprise was formidable. In April 1848, Wilkins, Carter & Company introduced a hardcover edition of Jane Eyre. Priced at $1, 4 times the price of the Harper's edition, it appeared in the Home Library of Entertaining Books, which was introduced as an experiment in publishing English literature of the first class. Editions were advertised as printed on good paper with fair type, executed as to render them worthy of a place in a select library. Although not directly named, the Harpers were clearly implicated as publishers who made works available, quote, only in the cheapest and most unreadable style of publication, end quote. One way to make friends with Harpers. In the days leading up to the Wilkins-Carter release, Ticknor & Company published their own 1 volume of Jane Eyre, a fine edition printed on paper in large print. This edition, an apparent competitor, was actually produced from the same stereotype plates as the Wilkins-Carter edition. Some sheets with Wilkins-Carter's imprint were even issued in standard Ticknor bindings. In a description for a copy he sold to John Linseth in 2005, the antiquarian bookseller Kevin MacDonald points out that the type foundry that created the stereotype plates for Wilkins-Carter was one favored by Ticknor. MacDonald notes that Jane Eyre is absent from Ticknor's cost books and observed that Ticknor typically did not record job printing for other publishers, concluding that Ticknor likely ran off a few copies with his own imprint. As an experiment, the Home Library of Entertaining Books and this Ticknor edition proved to be short-lived. By October 1848, the Harpers acquired the stereotype plates, likely purchasing them outright from Wilkins Carter, and reissued Jane Eyre in hardcover under their own imprint the next month. By December 1852, Wilkins Carter and Company had dissolved. Meanwhile, Harper's cheap edition of Jane Eyre continued to spread through the US. First appearing in New York and Boston, copies became available in Cleveland, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, as well as in Raleigh, North Carolina, Montgomery, Alabama, and Washington, D.C. By April, it was being delivered express to Milwaukee, and by June, it had reached the Deep South in Natchez, Mississippi, by steamer. There were theatricals in Boston, and even a midnight review held on Boston Common. By April 1848, American publishers caught wind of a new novel by the same author. A Boston newspaper reported, "Worthing Heights and Agnes Grey" is the title of a work recently published in England, written by Currer Bell, the editor of Jane Eyre, and which we advised some American publisher to reprint forthwith. Newby had continued to encourage the mistaken belief that the two Bells were one and the same. Well aware of his machinations, Smith Elder published a third edition of Jane Eyre on April 15th, this time with Bell's statement disavowing the authorship of any other novels. If the Harpers learned of this statement, they chose to ignore it. On April 21st, they published Wuthering Heights with a title page announcing the novel as by the author of Jane Eyre. The Harpers clearly profited from perpetuating this false attribution. Their 1855 reissue of the novel still included the same misinformation, 7 years after Currer Bell's notice. Although Wuthering Heights was shorter in length than Jane Eyre, it appeared in 2 volumes priced at 25 cents each, or twice the cost of Jane Eyre, in Harper's Choice Library of Modern Romance. The content of Wuthering Heights presumably precluded it from admission to Harper Library of Select Novels. This time, the Harpers also issued a copy of Wuthering Heights in cloth for 75 cents, in contrast with their initial release of Jane Eyre, which came out only in wrappers. Within a week of the release of the Harpers edition, the Boston publisher Coolidge and Wiley published a 1-volume cheap edition of Wuthering Heights of their own, as John A. Linseth discovered while researching its publication date some years ago. The Coolidge and Wiley edition cost 25 cents, undercutting the Harpers' price by half. They too attributed Wuthering Heights to the author of Jane Eyre. It is unclear how this rival cheap edition met its eventual demise in print, but there are no known extant reprints or reissues of it. The publishing ruse did not fool all readers. Ticknor and Company, which sold Wuthering Heights out of its retail shop in Boston, had a discerning clientele. As W.S. Tryon writes, Wuthering Heights had to be sent back to Harper's because so many readers were dissatisfied with it. They say it is not by the author of Jane Eyre. Ticknor's domestic letter books document how the perceived profanity of Wuthering Heights would not allow customers to keep it in the house. Fields grimly noted how his firm had suffered, quote, considerable malediction on account of this new novel. Quote, we cannot convince our customers it is a good book. The ongoing misinformation scheme may have been seen as necessary by the Harpers as an attempted countermeasure against such reactions. Negative reviews proliferated. In June 1848, one reviewer advised that Wuthering Heights, quote, be banished from refined society. Despite such controversy, the Harpers continued to pursue new works by the Bells. In the late spring of 1848, they contacted Smith Elder and successfully offered to purchase the first proof sheets of Currer Bell's next work. The Harpers were surprised and angered soon after when George S. Appleton announced that he would be publishing The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall, a new novel by the author of Jane Eyre. I found Appleton's advertisement in the June 21st, 1848 issue of the Boston Atlas, about a week before Acton Bell's second novel was published in London. George S. Appleton, an independent publisher and bookseller in Philadelphia, appears to have been corresponding with Newby, who had misled him as to the identity of the book's author. Charlotte and Anne would travel to London that July to make their true identities known to George Smith. Meanwhile, Newby had already secured a bid from Appleton, leading the latter to announce in a June 23rd advertisement that The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was in press and would be ready next month in one volume. Appleton's edition never appeared in print. Instead, at the end of the following month, a notice appeared in the North American. Tenant of Wildfell Hall, a new book by the author of Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, is in the press of the Harpers. The Harpers edition was released on July 28th as a cheap edition in paper wrappers, 2 volumes priced at 25 cents each, and in cloth, 1 volume priced at 75 cents. Like Wuthering Heights, Tenant also appeared in Harper's Choice Library of Modern Romance. This time, although the novel was accurately credited as the work of Acton Bell on its title page, it was advertised by some as written by the author of Jane Eyre. To add to the confusion, the title page of both editions listed Acton Bell as the author of Wuthering Heights. This appears to have been yet another calculated misdirection, as one contemporary bookseller observed in a newspaper. The mystery which hangs over the name of the author or authors of the above tales together with Jane Eyre has done not a little, no doubt, towards attracting so generally the attention of readers and giving them so wide a popularity. What followed in the latter half of 1849 was consequential for all 3 sisters and their works. Emily and Anne both contracted tuberculosis. After Emily died in December 1848, Charlotte continued to work on a new novel, only intermittently, while caring for Anne, who finally died in May 1849. Devastated by these losses, Charlotte returned to her work in July with concentrated resolve, submitting the final manuscript of Shirley to Smith Elder in September 1849. Bell's new novel was eagerly awaited both in England and America, this time without any interference from competitors. The Harpers, in fact, paid Smith Elder £50 on September 20th for the proof sheets of Shirley. And as I learned while comparing multiple copies, the proofs were sent to New York before being fully corrected. Readings from the original manuscript appear in the O gathering of the earliest printings of Harper's 2-column cheap edition, textual variants that do not appear in the London edition, published on October 26th. Harper's cheap edition appeared in 1 volume priced at 37.5 cents on November 21st as part of its library of select novels. The Harpers also issued a cloth edition for $1 printed from a different setting of type, reflecting the novel's final corrected text. Shortly afterward, T.B. Peterson prepared Agnes Grey for release that December, both in the form of a 25-cent 1-volume cheap edition and as a serial running in the Saturday Gazette. Peterson was just as unscrupulous as his other colleagues. Both the cover and title page of his novel bill Agnes Grey as an autobiography by the authors of Jane Eyre, Shirley, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, etc., etc., etc. This coming long after news stories had circulated in the U.S. contradicting the lie. A Boston newspaper was skeptical. Although Agnes Grey was said to be from the pen of the author of Jane Eyre, we have great doubts. Agnes Grey swiftly sank into oblivion after its brief appearance in print in the United States, and it would not be reprinted in America for more than 2 decades. When Villette appeared in 3 volumes in January 1853, it met with an eager readership in England and America, and without the ambiguity surrounding the publication of the Brontës' prior works. By this time, Brontës' identity was well known abroad despite her continued use of a pseudonym. The Harpers yet again paid for early proofs. Published in 1 volume priced at 50 cents, the novel was popular upon its initial release, which appeared in 3 distinct printings, or at least 3 that I discerned, as I discovered in the Linseth collection comparing multiple copies. No other US publishers attempted to intervene. So compared to their colleagues in America, European publishers were more quickly and accurately informed. Generally speaking, they did not attempt to conflate the sisters' identities, although there were some exceptions. As Len Tatlock has noted, the German publisher Verlags Comptoir published Wildfell Hall in 1850 as written by Acton Currer Bell, and Wuthering Shoah in 1851 as by Alice Currer Bell. In 1851, the same publisher issued other titles by Acton Currer Bell, including De Geschwister and Rockingham, and by Seabell, Der Sturmvogel. These last two titles unnoted by Tatlock. In 1853, the Dutch publisher A. Tergoen followed suit, publishing Broder and Zuster by Acton Currer Bell. This appears to be the last year that this kind of fraud was perpetuated. Charlotte Bronte's identity was published in France as a Miss Bronte in the Revue des Deux Mondes in 1853. And as in America, Currer Bell's name had more currency in Europe than her sisters. In 1848, Tauchnitz published Jane Eyre in English in its collection of British authors, and a second edition appeared in 1850. In Berlin, Duncker and Humblot published a translation, Johanna Eyre, in 1848 as part of their Britannia series. In France, Paul-Émile Durand-Forgue adapted the novel into French for serial publication in Le National that ran from April 15 through June 11, a stopgap when Madame Charles Raybo's forthcoming novel, Hélène, was delayed. Durand-Forgue's adaptation was very influential. J. Dillon, who discovered the publication, has traced the serial's reappearance to Belgium and Sweden and to a family of Spanish texts when, in 1849, the Administration del Correo de Ultramar in Paris published a translation, Juana Eyre, Memorias de un Aya, that was later reset and published in Havana, Cuba, both as a printed edition and as a serial that recirculated in periodicals in Chile and Bolivia in 1851. This is remarkable. In 1855, Hachette published the adaptation in book form, which in turn served as the basis for a Russian translation published in St. Petersburg in 1857. Jane Eyre proliferated in additional translations and abridgments during this time. In 1849, a serialized Russian translation appeared. A Dutch translation published by C.M. van Bolhuis followed in 1849 and 50, its preface remarking on the positive reception of Jane Eyre in England and Europe. Germany and France, he said, considered it an honor to translate Jane Eyre into their languages. A Danish translation followed in 1850. That year, too, Baudry's European Library and A.W. Galignani and Co. published their own English language edition of Jane Eyre as number 465 of their series, Collection of Ancient and Modern British Authors. Charlotte Bronte's death, which was widely reported in European newspapers, led to an even greater interest in her writings. And you can see here in this particular slide how those writings compare to publications of the other novels. In Sweden, there was a new two-volume translation by C.J. Backman, published by C.A. Leffler in December 1855. Backman, who also translated Dickens and Thackeray, included in his preface a tribute to Bronte commemorating her life. In Denmark, Jordan Forlag published a new three-volume edition in 1856 and 57 as part of the selected novels of Currer Bell. By 1860, there were 4 different versions of Jane Eyre available in German in book form in at least 5 different editions. In France, 2 translations appeared in at least 4 different editions, appearing in at least 3 different printings in 1860. In Belgium, Durand-Forgue's translation was produced in 2 editions. The only other Bronte novel that came close to this level of popularity in Europe was Shirley, which appeared on the continent in 1849. There were at least 2 different printings in English by Tauchnitz before 1852, as well as an English edition published by Baudry and Galignani. There were 3 translations in German and 2 translations in French that were reprinted at least twice in the next decade, as well as translations in Dutch, Danish, and Swedish, this being a Dutch edition with illustrated title pages. Although Villette was published by Tauchnitz in English, remarkably, it was not produced as a book in France until it was translated in 1932. 1932. For Gallimard, 8 decades after it first appeared in London in 1853. Baudry and Galignani also did not publish Villette in English, as they had Jane Eyre and Shirley. The unauthorized French translation, serialized from March to November 1855 in the Revue Britannique, did not appear in book form at all in France. Why did French publishers neglect Villette? It seems that most French readers preferred more sentimental novels. In an 1853 review, Eugene Forsade acknowledged Brontës' immense talent and force virile, but held that although she astonished and interested her readers, she could not emotionally move them. And this is a rough translation of my own. He claimed, quote, "She preaches with a Titan's arrogant pride the moral strength of the human soul. There is in her books vigor and originality, never tears. She is a Protestant to the last fiber of her heart." Forsade found Brontës' novel, quote, "dull and cold, her imagination applied only to the vulgar incidents of mediocre lives." His response helps to explain the 1855 serialized French adaptation, which took great liberties with Brontës' text. For example, adding an entirely new opening paragraph of saccharine, precious prose before outing Mrs. Bretton as Mrs. Graham on page 2. This version of Villette circulated simultaneously as a serial in Brussels, where it was also published in a 3-volume edition and reissued in paper wrappers in Lebrun's Bibliothèque Internationale series. Through 1860, Villette appeared in 2 German translations, as well as in Danish, Swedish, and Dutch. Emily and Anne's novels met with less success. Whether The Tenant of Wildfowl Hall and Wuthering Heights proved morally objectionable or simply unsaleable remains unclear. Tenant was translated into German, Dutch, and Danish editions that appear not to have been reprinted. There are no known early translations in French. Tenant was also not published in English on the continent at all during this time, being the only novel by the sisters that was never included in Tauchnitz's series. Given the unfavorable reception of Tenant in England, it is surprising that the preface of the 1849 2-volume Dutch edition, the Bewonster van Wildfowl Hall, presented up here, was said to be well received in England in the preface, which discussed the book's printing in 2 editions as a sign of its popularity instead of as a measure of its controversial content. Following Acton Bell's preface, the Dutch defended the novel's, quote, "purely moral nature." You will notice that this edition features pictorial title pages, making it the earliest known illustrated edition of any of the Brontës' works, a fact that has long gone undetected. Wuthering Heights, which was published in English by Tauchnitz with Agnes Grey, made even fewer appearances on the continent. It was translated into German as Wutheringshohe in 1851 and reissued in 1857 after the release of Gaskell's biography. But like Tenant, no early translation in French is known, much less translations in Danish, Dutch, Russian, Spanish, or Swedish. Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey were not included in Baudry's and Galignani's English library either. On its own, Agnes Grey was not very saleable. A slim novel of only 70,600 words, it generally survived in larger volumes, bound with Wuthering Heights or Shirley. After its publication by Tauchnitz in 1851, it reappeared in 1859 when Hachette published a French translation of Shirley together with Agnes Grey. The only known standalone copies of Agnes Grey in Europe were 2 translations in German and Danish in 1851 that do not appear to have been reprinted. The Professor was published by Tauchnitz in 1857, shortly after Smith Elder's edition appeared. It was quickly translated into Danish in 1857, as well as in German and French. However, there were no apparent contemporary reissues or reprints, at least none that I could find. Okay, staying in print. On March 31st, 1855, the world learned that Currer Bell was dead, as Harriet Martineau's unsigned notice proclaimed following the obituaries first appearing in northern newspapers. An announcement in the Bradford Observer consolidated the reputation of Mrs. Nichols, formerly Miss Brontë, as having achieved lasting renown. Numerous stories followed alluding to her unusual life circumstances as well as the passionate force of her writing. The death of Currer Bell was paving the way for a new story to be told, not the life of Miss Brontë or Mrs. Nichols, but that of Charlotte Brontë. It was also paving the way for more books to be sold. At the end of 1855, Elizabeth Gaskell contacted George Smith to propose a biography that would, quote, make the world honor the woman as much as they have admired the writer. Smith immediately recognized the commercial value of such a book. He wasted no time in contacting Patrick Brontë, who subsequently asked Gaskell to write Charlotte's biography. While Gaskell began her research, Smith formulated his own plan. 8 years after its initial publication, Jane Eyre was selling well, but sales were starting to decrease. The uniform edition had sold about 490 copies that year, 149 copies fewer than in the prior year. The uniform edition of Shirley sold 370 copies, 120 copies fewer than Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey lagged even farther behind, with just 133 copies sold that year and 120 copies the year prior. In February 1855, he had remaindered the first edition of Villette for 15 shillings, more than half off its original retail price. As news stories about Charlotte's death continued to circulate, Smith planned a 5th edition of Jane Eyre, ordering a print run of 3,000 copies in October 1855. Of course, the issue of a 5th edition was largely a marketing convention. It was printed from the exact same stereotype plates as the 4th edition, excepting the title page and advertisement, which was integral with the book's final gathering. By June 1856, Smith had sold 521 copies, recovering much of his outlay for the book, and the remaining 206 copies of the 4th edition had sold out. In July 1856, Smith Elder had their binders divide up the remaining sheets of the 5th edition of Jane Eyre. 1,200 copies were bound to match the uniform edition, and 1,000 debuted in the bright orange cloth of Smith Elder's 2-shilling cheap series. Although the 1856 cheap edition realized less of a profit than the uniform edition, Smith was pursuing a longer-term strategy. He was reaching larger audiences, and his agents were helping distribute copies among bookstalls in high-traffic areas, such as railways. When Gaskell's life began to be advertised in February 1857, sales of Jane Eyre skyrocketed. By June 1857, all 2,200 copies of the uniform edition and cheap edition had sold out. In July, Smith ordered a printing run of 20,000 copies of the cheap edition, followed by yet another 5,000 copies in September. It's summarized here as 25,000, but if you look at the other half of the ledger, you see it broken up. So 10 years after its initial publication, Jane Eyre was selling more copies than it had during the first years of its release. That same year, Smith Elder also reissued Shirley, Villette, and Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey in cheap editions. After Jane Eyre, Shirley was the most popular work written by the sisters, with 27 copies printed in July 1860. Villette was printed in 22,000 copies total during this period, and Wuthering Heights and Agnes Grey printed in 17,000 copies. By January 1858, Smith Elder had printed 33 copies of the 5th edition of Jane Eyre in its various reprints alone, with another 5,000 copies following that July. Although the ledgers documenting the original print runs for the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th editions of Jane Eyre are no longer extant, these printings may have reached 10,000 in number, tallying to a print run of 48,000 by 1858. And this is just the 5th edition. Here displayed on this graph. To put these numbers in perspective, Thackeray reported with pleasure that Vanity Fair sold 1,500 copies by August 1848 and considered that his book was doing very well commercially. During its first decade in print with Bradbury and Evans, Vanity Fair circulated in 5 printings with no more than 12,250 copies of any single part by 1857. That's its first decade in print. To take another best-selling novel, for example, William Blackwood printed 13,940 copies of George Eliot's Adam Bede during its first year in print. The next year, printing decreased to 1,004 copies, then diminished to 502 copies by year 3. Blackwood issued 3,018 copies as part of a collected edition in year 4, but that dropped to 1,008 copies in year 6, and then down to 500 copies in year 8. When Blackwood attempted to sell Adam Bede in a large printing run of 13,000 sixpenny parts in year 9 of its publication, most of these went unsold, the book settling into a run of 2,000 copies by the 6th number. Comparing these figures, Charlotte Bronte's commercial success is astronomical. Unlike Thackeray or Eliot, she was an outsider who lacked any social connections to London publishers or to literary society. Charlotte's death and Gaskell's biography also led to the recovery of Emily and Anne's reputations. In 1857, Smith Elder began marketing the sisters' works as a uniform edition of the works of Currer Bell, together with the works of Ellis and Acton Bell. And after spending more than a decade in literary exile, The Tenants of Wildfell Hall was published in 1859 by Smith Elder, who advertised it as part of the uniform edition of the life and works of the Brontë sisters, Currer, Ellis, and Acton Bell. In the US, demand for the Bronte's works also increased following these patterns. As in England, Jane Eyre and Shirley sold best, though all the novels, aside from Agnes Grey, enjoyed more Harper printings starting in 1855, as this table shows. Agnes Grey was out of print, which is not why it's not in here for that reason. Derby and Jackson licensed the plates from the Harpers and reissued Jane Eyre, Shirley, Villette, and The Professor each year in 1856, from 1856 to 1860, as part of its standard female novelist series, which is not shown here at all. Carleton followed suit, reissuing the novels with illustrated frontispieces in 1864, 1865, 1866, 1867, and 1870. Emily and Anne's novels were not included in these later reissues. The cultural capital contributed by the Life was substantial. In David Masson's 1859 Survey of English Literature, British Novelists and Their Styles, Miss Brontë is the only woman novelist listed in the table of contents under British novelists since Scott. She is one of the only 3 women authors named in its table of contents, the 2 other being Mrs. Radcliffe and Miss Austen. Masson, who served as a professor of English literature at the University of College London, discusses Miss Bronte's refreshing innovation in English novel writing and her higher poetic power. By 1864, Charlotte Brontë is mentioned in William Smith's edition of A History of English Literature, a student manual spanning Anglo-Saxon literature to modern novelists. Notably, Charlotte Brontë is the only woman novelist born in the 19th century who is listed in his textbook. The brief entry praises Jane Eyre, Shirley, and Villette as, quote, remarkable works exhibiting great knowledge of human nature and striking power. The novels of Dickens and Thackeray, which had been mentioned in Masson's work, are not discussed at all in this textbook. So, this is following 10 years, just within about 10 years after her death. She is in textbooks. This is just amazing. A critic who scoured Wuthering Heights in 1848 predicted that it would live a short and brilliant life and then die and be forgotten, which begs the question, would Emily and Anne's novels have survived in print if Jane Eyre had never been written? Publishing is not only a business, it is also an act of preservation. Many of the editions and printings discussed in this study survive only in a handful of printed volumes. Some have taken more than a decade to identify. By studying how works were or were not reprinted in the past, we gain a clearer sense of the precarity of what survives and what is lost. And finally, the importance of documenting what remain a fragile and incomplete history. Thank you.